today's program is about something relating to the current issues in the news relating to this Palestine-Israel justification of their so-called right to be on the land. So I decided to delve into the history of that particular region and to look at who are the indigenous or so-called indigenous people of the land. And I'm focusing on one book really, or a couple of books by one author to give a different perspective from the perspective that you hear in the international media about these current people being the indigenous people, whether the Israelites or the Jews or the Arabs of the region that are currently in the region. Anyway, the book I'm looking at is a book by Michael Bradley. Well, two of his, well, one is a paper and one is a book. The book is The Iceman Inheritance. This is a book that was, the introductions for this book is written by John Henrik Clarke, the well-known, or the late well-known Afrocentric scholar. So it's a bit of, that's some interest. You know, that's why, well, back in the years when I first read the book, it's the reason why I read it basically, because it was endorsed by an Afrocentric scholar. And it's a book that was mentioned but also by Leonard Jeffries, Professor Leonard Jeffries in the early 90s. He took a lot of flack for agreeing with what Michael Bradley was saying about the ancient history of that particular region and the history of the people coming from Europe into that region. As I said, there are questions about who the original people of that land were. And I'll also be looking briefly at the incoming mindset of these people into that region and the origins of this monotheistic mindset, which many like to tout as the proper understanding of spirituality, that somehow those who were polytheistic were somehow backward, and that the people who brought this new way of thinking were somehow more civilized or more advanced in their spiritual understanding. So the other book by Michael Bradley, the other paper I should say, is The Rise and Fall of Esau's Empire. It covers the same subject, but with additional information, I should say. But what I'm going to do is take certain texts or paragraphs from both of these books, and then we can see what is understanding of the origins of the peoples that came into the region and the way these people thought. And you can see it prevalent in Western society today, or even Western thinking today, I should say. So the book talks about the Neanderthals, and basically what it's saying is that the Neanderthals that resided in certain parts of Europe, and even in certain parts of Lebanon, the mountainous regions of Lebanon, as the Neanderthals tended to reside in mainly mountainous regions, the colder mountainous regions, and they were still existing up until maybe 3,000 to 4,000 years BC, before they are pushed out by the Homo sapiens. But they're not completely pushed out. In Europe, the Homo sapiens intermingled to some degree with the Neanderthals, so their mindset was somehow incorporated into certain areas of Western thinking. So the term Neanderthal itself comes from the skull that was discovered in the Neander Valley in Germany back in 1856. So that's when they first, it wasn't the first discovery, but that's when the skull was given that name. The Caucasoids are those who resided mainly around the Caucasus Mountains in southern Russia, coming into northern West Asia region. And they intermingled with the Neanderthals, as I said, to form people with a certain mindset or thing. But if you look at the Asiatics, or the Aryans, I should say, who went into down into India, or moved into India around the same period, 4,000, 3,000 BC, their mindset wasn't that monotheistic. because they moved into a region that was polytheistic. They also brought some of their own polytheistic mindset, even though it also began to degrade the position of the female in the Indian region. So anyway, let's take a quotation. First quotation I'm going to look at is the one about the Neander Valley. This one states that Dr. Schaufferson examined the skull found in the Neander Valley and pronounced it to be a relic of one of the barbarous tribes that inhabited Europe before the Celts and the Germans. And this called as I said, they called the Neanderthal. Neanderthals, there was a difference between the Neanderthals of Europe and the Neanderthals found in West Asia. The Neanderthals, according to Michael Bradley, the Neanderthals of the West Asian region, that mountainous region stretching from Lebanon going through to Iran, they were milder, they were not so harsh in their attitudes towards the woman. They were not so aggressive in nature. As he says here, the Neanderthals of the Zagros, the Levant, and of Central Eurasian were less extreme than the Neanderthals of Western Europe, who lived in the art of worm. Worm is the glacial period, the last ice age, I should say. But in spite of some west to east decrease in brutality, the Neanderthals were an exceptionally cohesive genotype in terms of both morphology and culture. So basically they were the same, but one was less harsh. I'll take another quotation from Esau's Rise, The Rise of Esau. This is one of Mr. Bradley's papers. And this one is stating that there were many waves of these Caucasus barbarians, most of them much too early to be differentiated very well by history and archaeology, but they affected all of the former Mediterranean to India civilization, as I said, as they moved. The reason they moved from southern Russia and the Caucasus area into the West Asian region is because after the ending of the last ice age, the ice caps began to melt, and the sea levels rose over a period of a few hundred years, about 300 feet. So people living around those lowland areas near the lakes and rivers had to move out of those regions, and many of those people, some moved into Europe, moved westward into Europe, others moved down or up, depending on how you look at it, into the West Asian region, over into Lebanon, Syria, Lebanon, down into Canaan. And this took place over a period of a couple thousand years. The last migration was around 1500 BC. These were the Hittites or the Ixos. Some call them shepherd kings. This could correspond in some ways to the movements of the Hebrews or the so-called Israelites or Jews into the region, and some other tribes. And that's why you find the Egyptians in particular, the Kemites, talking about the Asiatics coming to their region. These are the basically the Europeans that moved into the area with their new mindset. Anyway, I was reading what he said. There were many waves of these Caucasus barbarians, most of them much too early to be differentiated very well by history and archaeology, but they affected all of the former modern Mediterranean to India civilization to a greater or lesser extent. The earlier waves were assimilated into the previous established cultures that probably was barely changed at first, but later migrants, invaders, increasingly imposed their own Caucasus cultural values. This is the monotheistic mindset that he's talking about. Their cultural values. Eventually, by around 1500 BC to 2000 BC, there was almost complete Caucasian invasion, conquest, enslavement, and the consolidation of former independent townships into the first slave-powered city-states and then slave-powered empires. This is as they began to take over the region with their new ways of thinking. And you could argue that the Israelite idea of conquering the Canaanites, that mindset came out of these people. Because you have the story of Abraham, who was staying in Chaldea, which is east of Lebanon, east of Canaan, Phoenicia. And one of the stories I read about the reasons why he didn't get along too well in that region of Chaldea is because the people were polytheistic, and they had some contention with people who were coming in with this new mindset of monotheism. Basically, two different cultural values. As these people came up from the Caucasus regions, they came with their mindset, and some settled, others didn't settle. Abraham didn't settle, so he moved westward towards the region of Lebanon, Israel, as you call it today. And he came with a monotheistic mindset. That's why I think you probably have going down from that period up till around the 7th century when Islam was formed. That's the period when the monotheistic mindset was beginning to set in that region. Dr. Ronoko Rashidi is an Afrocentric scholar who passed away a couple of years ago. He wrote something about the nature of because there's a contention about who were the indigenous people of the Mesopotamian region. That's also called the Chaldea region of, that's somewhere around Iraq, Iran. Most Western scholars identify them as somehow Asiatic, basically Caucasian types. But Dr. Ronoko Rashidi and other Afrocentric scholars, even European scholars, as I'll show in a moment, identified them as one scholar identifies them as Dravidian, that is black Indian type, dark-skinned Indian type with straight hair. Or others identify them as Africans with African type here. Here, from his book, Introduction to the Study of African Classical Civilizations, Dr. Ronoko Rashidi has a quote here: "The founders of the Mesopotamian civilization were black Sumerians. Mesopotamia was the biblical land of Sinnar, Sumer. The Sumerians left no doubt to how they viewed themselves racially. The Sumerians called themselves Sagiga, the black-headed people. Sumer was at the crossroads of Asia, Africa, and Europe." So that's a quotation. There's other quotations by other scholars. Let me move down to Dr. John Baldwin. Dr. John Baldwin was an anthropologist from around the 18th century, around 1800s. The early colonists of Babylonia were of the same race as the inhabitants of the Upper Nile, as the black Egyptians. That's from his book, Prehistoric Nations. And then H.G. Wells said that the Sumerians appear to have been a brownish people with prominent noses. Some would argue those are more like the Dravidians of India. So the nature of the people that originally resided in those regions were, if you look at the general history, it's that the Homo sapiens from Africa moved into that region, then moved across to India and also into Europe. When they moved into Europe, eventually, because of the ice ages, their skin tones became lighter. So the original peoples, to some it's quite obvious, and historical records show also. Historical records were accepted by those who are more clear-headed, you could argue. We'll see that the people of the region were dark-skinned, and these Caucasoids came later on. Okay, now the next part, I'm going to look at the cultural mindset and the differences in mindset from the could say the African or the southern people of the southern hemisphere, as opposed to the Euro-Neanderthal that came into the region later on. So, a quote from page 84. This is in relation to the Neanderthal hatred or this despising of women, basically. Their attitude towards women was a suppressive one. In his book, Michael Bradley argues that the Neanderthal didn't like women because women have this capacity to reproduce, which the male doesn't have. So they saw that almost as a threat, the fact that they were incapable of doing certain things which women could do. So that's one of the reasons why there was always a certain attitude towards women. Plus the males of that Neanderthal male was quite aggressive, and those who didn't fit into their idea of how human behavior is supposed to be, they tended to suppress, hence their suppression of women. So here he says, these are some of the changes that took place in the region of the Levant, particularly when the Hebrews started to settle there. So he's saying that where once the earth goddess enjoyed absolute primacy after the coming of the Mycenaeans and Dorians, Hera became the wife of Zeus, where the female deities were once dominant across the region, even in Europe. After the coming of the Neanderthals and that new mindset, you find that female deities were suppressed, female gods were suppressed, or the idea of female gods was suppressed, and the male gods began to dominate. So it says, Hera became the wife of Zeus, Artemis, the sister of Apollo. So instead of these two being the dominant gods, they now became the sisters of male deities. Among the Levantines, once all-powerful Ishtar was made to share her throne with Baal and Marduk. And further along. But relics, this is in Judaism, the remnants of the female deity support or worship. But relics of the older order linger even within Judaism. During the Jewish feast of Purim, an ancient fertility feast commemorating the harvest and the generosity of the Earth Mother, then pomegranates, a fruit sacred to the goddess, are much in evidence. And during our time of the survival of feminine power and the identity, one can see automobile bumper stickers bearing the gentle reminder, mothers and daughters light Shabbos candles, a remembrance of the time when the holy days were sacred to females, and the regenerative principle. So the regenerative principle, which is seen as maybe a female principle, is something that was more prominent. I think it's more prominent in a society which is more settled, and a society which focuses on reproduction and growth as opposed to strife and war, which probably those coming out of the northern regions of the world, which had harsher conditions, may have had that mindset as opposed to a more settled mindset. Page 75 is concerning the psychosexual maladaptation of the males. It's saying, experience of the Neanderthal Caucasus stock suggests that this major group of mankind may be psychosexually and physically sexually maladapted compared to other races. Sexual dimorphism on the one hand and the smothering of sexual. So because of the social conditions, harsh conditions in the mountainous regions, cold ice age mountainous regions, sexual activity was suppressed and the desire for sexual activity was suppressed. So the males didn't focus too much on sexual activity. So that's why they may have had some aggressive attitude towards the female. The fact that they didn't want to fully practice their role with the female. Here we go. Sexual dimorphism on the one hand, and the smothering of sexual sensual adaptations on the glacial ones, on the other hand, may have combined to render Caucasus slightly more frustrated sexually, with a slightly higher degree of sexual approach avoidance, so they have no desire for sex, and aggression towards women who maybe were trying to seduce their men into sexual activity, but the men, with their aggressive nature, were not interested. Perhaps more alienating because of the difference in appearance between helpmates and possessing a greater amount of undisplaced temporal territorial aggression. So basically, the men were more aggressive towards the women, and the women's attempts to, I wouldn't say seduce the men, but have the men show more interest in them was seemed to be probably rebuffed in an aggressive manner.